TFM.
Welcome, Boomers, to another episode of Warp 5, our dedicated Star Trek Enterprise podcast. I'm Christopher Jones, and with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, Matthew Rushing. And Matthew, I've got an important assignment for you today. I know you're going to be excited about this.
Oh, okay.
Microscope installation with Doctor Phlox.
It's the plasma is running a little hot. I got to go check on that. So, I don't know, maybe Malcolm could help her out.
I think so. I guess he can handle it. It's a fairly simple process. It just starts off by inserting the thick end into this opening.
Well, I think, yeah, that sounds like that's right up Malcolm's alley.
All right. Yes, today we're going to talk about the episode in which Doctor Phlox, Dr. Phlox's second wife, comes aboard to install a neutron microscope, but it's also the episode that delves into a very serious matter with T'Pol and her Pinar syndrome, and that's the episode Stigma. It is the 14th episode of Season 2. So, Matthew, let's just jump into the genesis of this episode, I guess, is maybe a good starting point. And it's interesting because this episode was part of Viacom's HIV awareness campaign in early 2003. And it wasn't explicitly created like there was a direction from the studio that you have to do an HIV-themed episode, but Rick Berman said that he and Brandon Braga attended this meeting where all the executives and showrunners had come together, and the network did this presentation that he thought was very well done, and it moved them to move forward with coming up with a story that would fit into that. And they came up with this idea of mind melds being a taboo thing in Vulcan society, and that those who could practice that might contract a disease, and that those people would be shunned by Vulcan society. And I've always felt that this episode can feel heavy-handed in its message, or it can also kind of go past the viewer if they're not thinking along those lines. So it's not heavy-handed in the sense that I think that it comes across that way to everybody. It just sort of depends on how you approach it. But anyway, what are your initial thoughts on this episode?
Yeah, I was thinking about that as I was watching it, about whether or not this is in any way heavy-handed. And in that, I thought, okay, well, would I call then episodes of the original series heavy-handed,
Right.
when they deal with specific issues? And my answer was, no, right? I mean, like, the point of the episodes was to speak to a specific issue. And I think that regardless of where you fall down on some of the behind-the-scenes things that this episode might be referring to, right? I think anybody should be somebody who cares about people and cares about taking care of people. And so regardless of what type of disease they have or how they may have contracted it, the fact that anybody has any type of disease is terrible. And we as human beings should care about human beings and helping those in need, right? And I think that really is what this episode is really trying to get across, is that idea. Because I do think that this is one of the things. It all comes down to how we treat others, and whether we're going to treat other human beings with dignity, and with that they deserve to be treated as we would want to treat anybody else, or we just randomly start to choose who and what deserves to be treated like a human being. And,
Right.
I think, that gets us into all kinds of trouble because the societies that we've seen that begin to dehumanize people for any type of reason are damaging and wrong, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so look, and I think the biggest part of it is there are so many big things behind the scenes, that this episode is kind of talking about. But in the end, I think the main core message of it, which is that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, especially those in need from a physician because of any kind of illness, should be treated with dignity. And I think that's something that we can all agree on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the point about physicians is a good one because it's interesting in this episode, and maybe it speaks to something about the Vulcan logic and how logic can be used to create that dehumanizing, which I guess is an odd word used for Vulcans because they're not humans, but devulcanizing view of people who you don't approve of. And the doctors themselves are not willing to really find a cure for the disease because they disapprove of the people who contract the disease.
Right.
And that's a scary thing to think of in our own world if doctors had that view. I think it's the basic core of the Hippocratic Oath that
yes,
you don't take that approach. We see that it's spoken to in DS9 as well with Bashir. There's actually an episode by that name. But all throughout Star Trek, we've always seen the doctors help someone in need, aliens in need, even enemies in need, because that's what you do as doctors. And then here you've got these doctors who are interrogating T'Pol. They are refusing to share data that could be used by Phlox to help T'Pol. And they also seem to just be taking a snail's pace at finding a cure anyway, because why would they want to cure a group of people who might disappear if they don't provide treatment, which is just
right.
A horrible thing. But I guess to that point, the way that this episode mirrors the HIV issue, I think it does it well in that at this point in time, well, for Vulcans, I suppose that there's an understanding of mind melds and what they are because it's been part of the cultural tradition for a long time, but it seems that it's something that had been viewed as dangerous in the past and it's become taboo, and maybe they don't want this to come back. From the human perspective, the idea of Vulcan mind melds is something very new, because even in the original series, it seems to be something that humans don't really know that much about. And for newer Star Trek viewers who entered through Voyager, or especially these days Discovery, the idea that mind melds exist and it's something that Vulcans can do, and that Vulcans have telepathic powers. We see telepathic powers on steroids in Discovery with the way that Sarek and Michael Burnham can communicate over great distances, right? It might seem like something you just take for granted as part of what Star Trek is, but at this point, when this story was written, it was still a time of exploring and kind of fleshing out what are mind melds, what's the background of it, what's the history of it. And so there's an element of ignorance, and because of that ignorance, an element of prejudice at play when it comes to Pinar syndrome on the Vulcan side. And that's a lot of what was happening in our own world in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s with regard to HIV and AIDS and the communities through which it was spreading more easily. There was prejudice against some of those groups, as well as ignorance as to how the virus spreads, which caused a lot of fear. I remember because I grew up through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and I remember very well what the atmosphere was like at that time. And so I felt like Rick and Brandon did a good job of of hooking into that to tell this futuristic story of this other disease, Pinar syndrome, and made a pretty effective story to raise awareness of HIV without making it so obvious that that's what they're doing, that it's heavy-handed, as we were discussing at the beginning.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you think about this just from the Star Trek standpoint, and the fact that, you know, this series specifically decided that what it wanted to do was to explore Vulcans in a very interesting way, and to not just make them cookie-cutter versions of the Vulcans that we already knew, but give them a place that they would grow to, that we would see them as a society that would change within the 100 years that we were going to have between this and Kirk's time. And I think what is very interesting about the fact that these Vulcans that we see here have a lot more in common with who we are, which is they are still Vulcans that hold to their own prejudices. And I think, to me, that fits so well within the context of this episode, right? This whole episode is actually about the different ways in which cultures clash. And hold different value systems, where
within
those
a
are
single overall culture. So not human and Vulcan cultures
Exactly.
clashing, but
yes,
cultures within the greater Vulcan culture clashing.
right. But I mean, but even in this episode, I mean, we have the way in which the Nobulan culture and the way that they deal with things kind of clashes with a more classic human understanding of morality, right? You know, so, but in that, you know, again, I think one of the beauties of the way that the episode deals with this is the fact that it places this within the Vulcan culture that allows us to kind of see a mirror of our own culture in the ways in which we may or may not be handling specific issues well, and where we still need to grow. But in just Star Trek, we've already seen Vulcans have their own prejudices against humanity, but also against different sects of their own culture. And I think that, to me, that's a really fascinating thing to be able to deal with and kind of wrestle with in Star Trek Enterprise. And I think it gives us the opportunity then, again, just to be able to take the Vulcans from one place to another, which is much more interesting than them just being this monolith that we already knew. Because otherwise, why are you doing this show in the first place? You know, I think there's no reason to actually do this show if you don't actually have somewhere to bring these characters and some place to bring these characters, and even the culture itself.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Denobulan element of the story, and that's another thing I wanted to talk about, because I feel like this episode is a particularly well-crafted episode. The story, the writing, is, I think, very skillful in that, as you point out, the Denobulan story is humorous, but it's playing the same role as the very serious Vulcan story, which is highlighting cultural clashes, differences in views between cultures, in this case, the Denobulans and the humans, when it comes to relationships, because Feasel Phlox comes aboard, immediately starts hitting on Trip, and it's played up in a very comedic way where she's fully in control of the situation, seems to just be I think she's attracted to Trip, but she also seems like she probably is easily attracted to lots of people. Maybe she's curious about aliens. I don't know. But she seems to be having fun making him squirm and making him uncomfortable. And so it's presented in a comedic way, more or less. But and Dr. Phlox is fully on board with it he thinks it'd be great. I mean, Trip's got to be crazy not to want to, experience the magnificent Feasel Phlox. Meanwhile, Malcolm is warning him, don't make Phlox angry. But the moment where Dr. Phlox and Feasel laugh and say humans, I really love that moment because it just summed up the whole thing of how something that may seem culturally normal to you seems very different to someone from another culture. And sometimes it's really difficult to understand what the problem is or what the hang up is about something. And I think that was playing out in the Vulcan story here, where Archer can't understand the Vulcan position on this and is really pushing Auric to do something. And he's very concerned with saving T'Pol's career and also helping her health. And then on the other side, there's nothing grand at stake at all. But there's still this reaction of, why? Why not?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the fun part of this with, and the interesting thing about this is that with specifically the Denobulan human story here, I think what it goes to show is just how different cultures obviously have different ideas about different values. And it's not as though the Denobulans don't respect the human values, but, Feasel is still willing to try to entice Trip into experiencing something with her that she would love to experience with him. And it's not shown as being wrong or evil or any of those things. It's not shown really even as, we're not going down the road of this being harassment or anything else. This is normal for Denobulans, right? And it's not normal for somebody like Trip, who's from the Deep South and is raised, I think, with I would say, much more classic sense of morality. You don't play around with other men's wives. That's very, that's definitely very Southern, and very, something I think both you and I were probably raised in that type of environment well.
Just
from the
for
Deep
listeners
South.
who don't know our background, Matthew and I are both from the South, so we're not criticizing Southerners. We're pointing out an aspect of the culture that we grew up in.
100%. Yes, that was the culture, raised in myself. So, so I very much share that with Trip, that kind of uncomfort of like having somebody else's wife come on to you and not understanding, right, that this is something that is completely normal for Denobulans, right? They're very free with their sexuality, and as we know from them, they experience not only having 3 different wives or husbands depending on which sex you are in Denobula, but they're also free to pursue enjoyment with others. So all this to say, I think it creates the opportunity for us as a viewer to be able to explore the ideas of different cultures and different races and the different things that they hold dear in a very serious way and a very fun way in the same episode, which is, like you said, I think very smart in that it is well written because each part of the episode is actually helping and reinforcing the other, but just from a different perspective. And I think that's actually really, really smart because it's something that we should be willing to do. And whereas what we see on the Denobulan side, which is Trip, is he confronts Phlox, gets to the bottom through communication and understanding, and then politely declines. Whereas on the other side, what do we see? It takes, somebody revealing a secret. It takes somebody, losing their ability to practice medicine, losing their job. But in each way, like both things are very important. So, yeah, that was a really long, rambling answer, but there's so much in the way that this episode is so interconnected, which is actually great for the story.
Well, I think it's very deftly written because the denobulan fecal trip side of the story is written in such a way that it very much feels like a B-plot, the traditional A-plot, B-plot Star Trek story. But its importance is a lot higher than the B-plot of an episode usually is. But it doesn't necessarily feel that way. It certainly doesn't feel that way the first time that you watch, because the A-plot with the Pinar syndrome is so serious and has such an impact on the lives of the people involved that it really overwhelms the B story. And the B story feels like it's there for comic relief, because in that type of episode, you really can use a little bit of comic relief here and there. Otherwise, it's just too heavy overall. But in reality, the B plot, as we're saying, is playing the same role, and it's reinforcing the A plot, and vice versa. So I think that this episode is very deftly written and maybe isn't fully appreciated until you've watched it a few times and you really take in everything that's going on. In the case of Eurus, the Vulcan, who finally helps T'Pol and sacrifices, or potentially anyway, sacrifices his career, T'Pol is going to go and try to save him. The fact that he comes out to help was, again, I think a twist. The first time that you see the story, you're not expecting, because I think that the actor does a really good job of playing Eurus as being one of the same with the other doctors.
Right.
And, you know, it's that story of someone who has gotten themselves on the inside and is, I think, trying to do good from the inside, but doing it very, very cautiously and probably in a way that isn't enough to help the cause.
Right.
But when put into a situation where they must do something, then he steps up and he helps T'Pol. And then T'Pol's reluctance to reveal the fact that she was essentially raped, and that's how she got this disease, contracted this disease, is also an interesting element of the story here, because she feels the need to hide that to protect not the person who did this to her, which was Teleris. And we didn't mention this yet, actually, that this is a great tie-in to an earlier episode from season 1, Fusion, where they encounter the group of Vulcans called the Vitash Katur, who are kind of freewheeling Vulcans, I guess. But one thing that at least some of them can do is practice these mind melds, and Teleris was one of those, and he did that to her to help her have new experiences and open up to emotions. But he was infected with Pinar syndrome, and then that was passed to her. And so the central element of Stigma is the fact that the doctors think that she's one of these people, and they think that she goes around practicing mind melds, when in reality she didn't, and it was forced on her. But she doesn't want to reveal that because she doesn't want to protect Teleris, but she wants to protect people who would be persecuted because they have this natural ability to perform mind melds. So she has a much more open-minded view of Vulcan society, which is interesting because it's not something that we would have expected from T'Pol at the beginning of the series. But as her character has evolved, we see that in her, and perhaps it comes from her experience of serving with humans so long. But the part of the story where both Eurus and T'Pol are very resistant to speaking up, they want to stay behind the curtains, maybe in Eurus's case to protect himself, and in T'Pol's case, I don't know if she's so concerned about protecting herself, but she's concerned about protecting the group.
Right.
But in the end, they decide to speak up, and I think it makes a difference. But what did you think about that aspect of the story?
Yeah. I think the most interesting thing about this is where the story, it stops necessarily being an allegory for what we face here for humanity, and is really a big part of the story for Star Trek Vulcans, and the fact that they have lost this ability because they have actually stopped practicing it. That's something we'll learn later, is that they've actually, this is actually a birthright of all Vulcans. It's just been lost because it became a stigma somehow, which my guess is that it became a stigma because it allowed you to basically to share emotions.
Yeah.
And feelings and those kind of things, which, we know Vulcans suppressed because of everything that had happened to them. So, I think it all makes perfect sense as to why this is the case. But this allows us to see inside of the Vulcan people, and that they've actually lost part of themselves, and they're afraid of it. And this is where I think, obviously the metaphor kind of breaks down, because it is quite different than what they're talking about here for humanity. But I love that. I love the fact that this allows us to peek into the Vulcan society and to be able to see what's happening, and therefore what T'Pol is trying to protect is important, because it actually is something that is going to be important for Vulcan society moving forward. And to not want to stigmatize these people in any way, shape, or form, and give the powers that be a reason to continue to do so, is so noble, and I think really incredible for the character T'Pol. And it speaks so highly, very quickly, of what her character is. And that she is one who cares much more about the whole than just herself. She is definitely living out the Vulcan axiom of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes this such a good story here for the character of T'Pol, is the way in which it tells us that she is a Vulcan among Vulcans. She is, in many ways, the most Vulcan we see, in the fact that truly living out the ideas of what it means to be Vulcan. And, at the same time, too, she's also one who's not afraid to explore new ideas and new things, to allow herself to be challenged. And to broaden her horizons, which is, that's the way we learn, right? Vulcans or humans, we have to challenge our preconceptions and see if they hold up or not. That's the point of being out there, right?
Yeah. Well, broadening your horizons is a great point, because I think that T'Pol embodies the benefits that you gain when you widen your world. And the T'Pol that we saw in Broken Bow seemed like a T'Pol who had pretty much been in a narrow path on Vulcan. Like she completely bought in to the Vulcan view of things. And bit by bit, by being with humans and getting out and exploring and meeting other species who maybe she had seen before, some she had, of course, some she hadn't, because we have some first contact situations as well. But even if she had seen them before, maybe she hadn't interacted with them in the way that she does or did on the missions up to this point with Enterprise. And, I just think of myself. I grew up in Alabama, and I actually think about this from time to time. I live in Japan now. I've lived in Japan for 25 years. But I also lived in Russia. I've been to many countries. I've lived in different parts of the United States. And I have friends from all over the place, and a lot of this, most of this was before the age of podcasting, because now we get together, you and I are on opposite sides of the planet right now. But my point is that when you immerse yourself in various cultures, whether they be different regions of a large country like the United States, or they be countries other than the one in which you were born, and especially when you live there for a long time, your worldview expands so much, and it's so much easier for you to understand, or even if you don't agree, you at least can comprehend how different people think about things, and you can put yourself in their shoes, and often even your views do change. You grow to another position, or you just have so much more information to work with. And I think that's what we see in T'Pol from the beginning of the series to this point, about halfway through season 2. And we don't see that in the Vulcan doctors here. And their case is kind of interesting too, because they are people who probably do get around and go places. I mean, the fact that this conference is off-world, right? Mm-hmm. But it also speaks a little bit to age, I think, and the challenges of that. Because if you look at Oret, he's obviously a much older Vulcan, and he's very set in his views. And then Eurus is the youngest of the 3 doctors, and is, he has different views than Oret does.
Right. Yeah.
And expressing those views as Vulcans seems to be something that I think would be very challenging in their society, because to have any view that is different, I think would be something that's discouraged. And I think actually you asked earlier about mind melds and maybe why that practice was lost. And I think the ability to share emotions, like you said, is a key to it. But I think also the ability to more freely communicate with one another through that telepathic link was probably one as well, because the Vulcan government that we see in Enterprise seems to be at a place where finding a way to not allow people to share information in that way would be beneficial for them to stay in power.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense as to some of the behind the scenes reasons. I think what's interesting is, like you said, the way that this is actually going to play into the future and actually helps build the Vulcans that we're going to meet and the struggles that they are going to go through as a people. And what I think that this does really well is to help us see how set in their ways they are as a species. And because of that, we actually really see that being, of course, a big detriment to them. And I think that's something that can't be dismissed lightly, is just how well I think that this sets up who the Vulcan people are and why they're going to be in need of what we see, which is they need a reformation. And this gives us clearly the reason as to why that's the case. And I think that's really awesome. Here we can clearly see that these are people that are in need of a change because they have become so set in their ways. They're not willing to help people in their own society that need help, regardless of necessarily how they feel about them and their actions, and they're not even willing to make any exploration of the question. So I think that's a really interesting thing. And I love the fact that this is one of those places where, we talk a lot about on the Orb, about the ways in which they planted seeds that allowed us to be able to then, move forward in the seasons and created story opportunities for them to pick up later on. And this is one of those seeds that we're planting there with the Vulcans. And they've been pretty methodical about that idea, I think, throughout the whole series anyway. But this is just one more of those seeds. And I love it. I think this is the place where Enterprise had learned some of those lessons, I think, specifically from something like Deep Space Nine, and it really allowed them to be able to have some intercontinuity with the show without necessarily feeling like the whole show was just about being interconnected, which is exactly the lesson from Deep Space Nine, I think, that you wanted from Star Trek and for Star Trek. So it's a really great thing to see here, and it makes for an enjoyable rewatching experience, as we celebrate over 20 years now of Star Trek Enterprise. We're actually getting that benefit, and the show works on a rewatch because of these seeds that get planted.
And I think about how the Vulcans are used in the modern Star Trek series, the current series, and I think about this episode, and it's an important part of that. The Next Generation with Unification 1 and 2, and then this episode and what it establishes about kind of what's happening within the culture. And it's only a glimpse, but you can see that, there are problems in the culture and how it's progressing, as any culture will have. But it exists, and it's something that we didn't really have a feel for, certainly in the original series,
right,
or even in the Next Generation. But we get a bit here, and then we get a lot later in this series. And then you jump all the way ahead to Discovery. You've got Unification 3. You've got Navarre. You see how Vulcan society is just evolving over not just the centuries, but millennia. And I think it's just very interesting. And this episode plays an important part in building that all along the way. And then Enterprise especially plays the biggest part in evolving the Vulcan culture.
Yes.
All right. Well, that sounds like our final thoughts, actually. So what is your rating for this episode, Matthew?
Well, I think that this is a good episode of Star Trek Enterprise that deals with some really important issues, but also has a lot of fun doing it as well. And so I am going to give this 4 out of 5 denobulin pickup lines. And so I really enjoyed rewatching this. I especially just kind of enjoyed watching Trip try to deal with this. And I thought, there's such a stereotype about Trip that he's such a ladies' man. But so many times he doesn't ask for it, right? It just happens to him. It's not even his fault, and clearly here, this is definitely not his fault. And so, I thought that was great. And I do love the way that we continue to build the Vulcan society here. But I also think that this is another great episode where we are building the bond between First Officer and Captain, and Archer really willing to go to bat for T'Pol. Just shows how much their relationship has progressed. So all in all, this is a good episode of the series.
Yeah, absolutely. And my rating for this episode is kind of similar to yours. I'm going to give it 9 legs under the table. All right, everyone. We would love to hear your thoughts on Stigma. There are many ways for you to share those with us. Perhaps the best way is to go to Facebook and join the Babel Conference. That is our listeners group. If you're already a member, you know how it works. But if not, just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right on up. If it doesn't, just type the whole name, the Babel Conference. It is a closed group, so if you're joining for the first time, please do answer the questions and agree to the rules of the forum so that I can let you in. It's a closed group because we don't want it to just be another Facebook group. We want it to be an extension of the conversations that we have here on the podcast. So we do like to keep it there just for listeners. You can also send us email if you'd like. Just go to our website, trek.fm/contact. Use the form you find there. Choose to send to a show and choose Warp 5, and that'll come to Matthew and me by email. And you can also find us in social media, Instagram, Twitter, everywhere. Our username is TrekFM. Now, Matthew, when you're not initiating the neutron stream, where can people find you?
Well, when that's not happening, of course, you can find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02. So Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and Vero. Would love to catch up with you there. You can also find me here on the network. We've got an entire side of the network devoted to all the other fandoms that we love, and that's called the 602 Club, so you can join us there. You can also, of course, find the bonus shows with Snyder Cuts and Assembling Avengers that I do with John Mills in that same feed. Also, Chris, you and I talk about Deep Space Nine on The Orb. We talk about Star Trek Picard on Artificial Tango. We talk about Strange New Worlds on Saddle Up. And then we've got the books and comic show for Star Trek here, Literary Treks, doing that with Casey. So you can find all of those. You can also find me over on the Nerd Party Network. I do have a completed show there called Owl Post with Dre Kaufman, talking about all the chapters of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. And then the aforementioned John Mills and I do Aggressive Negotiations, which is a Star Wars podcast. Now, Chris, when you're not trying to figure out what movie to watch for movie night, where can people find you?
I go to Space Netflix, scroll through, see what's on, see what's new. But when I'm not doing that, you can find me here on the network doing all the shows together with you, which you mentioned. Also, Larry Nemechek and I do the Ready Room from time to time. And you can find me in lots of episodes of various shows in the back catalog. And if you'd like to chat about Star Trek or whatever, you can find me on social media. Twitter is where I'm most active. My username is C. Bryan Jones, letter C, and Bryan with a Y. But that is my username throughout social media, and I'd love to chat with you there. And if you would like to help us keep this show and everything we're doing on the network going, we could definitely use your help to find out how to get involved in the network, how to support us, especially with finances. You can visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM. And I want to send a huge thank you to everyone who's supporting us right now, because we would not be here without you. And thank you very, very much. Well, Matthew, I'm looking forward to next time when those pesky Andorians come back as we talk about Ceasefire.
Well, Chris, I'm always excited to have them back, so let's go.